Welcome. Today, we're diving into a fascinating and honestly, kind of mind-bending idea from the world of psychological systems theory. What happens when a system that's supposed to heal you actually starts to punish you for getting better? It's a paradox that flips everything we think we know about recovery right on its head.
So here's our roadmap for today. First, we're going to lay out what this paradox is all about. Then, we'll look at a system's built-in defenses. From there, we'll see how a healing person can, believe it or not, become a threat. Then we'll explore why the cure itself can seem incompatible. And finally, we'll pull it all together to redefine the wound itself.
All right, let's jump right into the heart of this thing. So this is the central question, and it's a real head-scratcher. A system, whether it's medical or therapeutic, it exists to make people better, right? So why on earth would it sometimes react badly, maybe even punish someone who is actually achieving real, deep, profound healing? It just doesn't seem to make sense. Now, right off the bat, it's really important to get this straight. This isn't about blaming individual doctors or therapists as bad people. The source material we're looking at points to a much bigger issue, a conflict that's baked right into the very structure of the system, where the system itself is unconsciously trying to protect its own foundations.
So, what is the system defending so fiercely? To really get why it reacts in such a strange way, we've got to look at its two core defense mechanisms.
First up, we have what the source calls normalized shame. This is the idea that our systems, and maybe even our whole society, kind of run on a baseline of unhealed wounds. It's this quiet background hum of inadequacy that's just accepted as a normal, even necessary part of being a functioning adult. You know, it's like the water we're all swimming in.
And the other side of that coin? Pride. But, and this is key, we're not talking about healthy self-esteem here. This is a defensive pride, a kind of grandiosity that acts like a shield. Its main job is to protect the system from having to face the shame of its own failures. When things go wrong, this pride reflexively just says, hey, it's not my fault, it's yours.
Okay, so you've got this foundation of normalized shame, and you've got this shield of defensive pride. Once you have those two pieces in place, you can suddenly see why a person who is genuinely healing becomes a major structural threat.
This creates a huge paradox for the person in charge. The whole therapeutic relationship is built on a hierarchy, right? The clinician is the expert. But here's the catch. When a patient is trying to heal a really deep identity wound, the clinician can only guide them as far as they've gone themselves. So if the patient's healing starts to go beyond the clinician's own unhealed territory, well, that's when you've got a problem.
And here's exactly how that threat plays out. A patient starts making real, authentic progress on that deep identity level. Pretty soon, their healing goes past the normalized shame that the clinician is still operating with. And just like that, the hierarchy flips. The patient is now modeling a level of health that the expert hasn't reached, and that makes them an unconscious threat to the whole power structure.
And this leads to the system's crucial defensive move. To put things back in order, it shifts its focus. It stops looking at the wound it can't heal, and instead, as the quote says, it pathologizes the person, not the wound. In other words, it labels the individual as the problem.
This is exactly where that defensive pride we talked about comes roaring in. See, when the standard treatments don't work on these really deep wounds, the system risks feeling the shame of its own limits. So pride flips the script. It's not that the treatment is flawed. No, it's that the patient is untreatable. And just like that, the blame is successfully shifted from a broken method to a broken person.
And if you think that's wild, it gets even weirder. This brings us to a point where the actual cure, the very thing everyone is supposedly working towards, becomes incompatible with the system itself.
The source material uses a really interesting word for the endpoint of this deep healing: innocence. Now, this doesn't mean being naive or childish. It means you're operating from your authentic core. It's a state where you're not threatened by the truth, you don't need validation from others, and you're pretty much resistant to being manipulated by shame. And this slide, wow, it just lays out the whole conflict perfectly. You have two completely different ways of seeing the exact same person. The system, which runs on external validation and control, looks at this person and labels them with a personality defect, or calls them arrogant. But a more holistic view sees the same behavior and calls it what it is: a brilliant adaptation to injury, a healing strategy.
Okay, so let's pull all these pieces together and try to redefine what's actually happening in this whole dynamic.
So here it is, the big idea in a nutshell. A person who achieves this deep level of healing learns to take off the masks of pride and performance.
But here's the kicker. The system itself depends on those exact same masks to keep its authority and structure intact. So when one person takes their mask off, they unintentionally shine a light on the unhealed wound of the entire system, forcing it to get defensive.
And all of this leaves us with one final, really provocative thought to chew on. What if what we sometimes label a disorder in a person isn't actually a sign that they are broken, but is instead the sound of a broken system being disrupted by the inconvenient power of truth?